Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Bunch. We are just awaiting a couple of other attendees. So if you give us a further minute, then I'll start properly. Thanks very much. See you in a minute. Okay, I think we've got about as many people in as we're going to expect. So, as I said, my name is Mark Bunch, and welcome to this webinar from Sigma-HSE on process safety management. I'm going to start by introducing myself and also tell you a little bit about Sigma-HSE. It's part of my contractual obligations to do so. I can get the screen to work. There we go. So yes, that's me. My background is as a chemical engineer, and I worked quite a few years as a chemical engineer before going into process safety in the late 1990s. I was working for BP at the time, but I've had experience in other major hazard industries, people like DuPont. I worked for them for a while, and then some of the larger EPC companies, that's engineering, procurement and construction. Whilst I was working consultancy, we developed some training materials for Cogent, which was formerly known as NSAPI, which was the National Skills Academy in the process industries, and we did some training in process safety management itself at different levels of organisation, so for engineers and for senior leaders and for operators as well. The senior leaders course was shorter than the others, and we took out all the hard, complicated mathematics for them, so they at least had a chance of understanding it all. And on the back of that, I developed the process safety course, which is part of the chemical engineering undergraduate scheme at the University of Huddersfield as well. And I have to say, it's the most interesting and fun part of my job. Sigma itself, we are a process safety consultancy as well as a desir and testing centre. We got offices all over the world now, based in Winchester in the UK, but we got offices in New Delhi and Hyderabad, and as well as Londonderry, not in Northern Ireland, but in New Hampshire in the USA. The laboratories that we operate are in Winchester and Hyderabad as well. The main three areas that we specialise in: consultancy that I've mentioned, the testing, the training is a variety of standard courses that we offer, as well as any bespoke training that might be required, things like development of operating procedures, for example, or specialist courses in HAZOP and HAZID, those kind of things as well. Chemical reaction testing is something that we do, thermal stability testing, explosion properties, gas and vapor properties, and electrostatics as well. All sorts of things. These are run out of our labs in Hyderabad and down in Winchester by very, very clever people who are considerably more experienced and knowledgeable than I am, so they'll be able to tell you all about it. I, however, specialise in the consultancy side, and this is the kind of things that we offer there. Process safety management implementations and review of your systems as well, desir and ATEX, HAZID and HAZOP, which is my particular interest, PHAs, Functional safety, that's safety integrity level determination, safety instrumented systems and safety instrumented functions as well. And of course the training workshops that go to back those up. Okay, so into the webinar proper now. I appreciate that we are an hour delayed. I apologize for that. I'm told it was some kind of IT glitch, but that seems to be a catch-all for all sorts of glitches. They're always IT, aren't they? What we want to do for you this afternoon is give you an overview. First of all, of what is required as part of a process safety management system, to tell you where the frameworks are found, what those frameworks contain, how you would go about developing those within your organization and disseminating them down throughout the organization. And then as a little bit of extra, some recent experience that we've had in the implementation of this sort of approach. So with that said, I would like to remind you of a couple of process safety incidents that have happened with a particular view in mind, and that is we are talking about process safety rather than occupational safety. When I give the training courses, I very often start by asking people, how did you come about this course? And they'll say, well, you were sent here. You get an email that says you're going on a safety course. So I asked them, how many people's hearts leap in joy at the prospect of another safety course? And very few people put their hands up to that. But process safety is different. It's inherently more interesting for a start, especially from my point of view. But it is different to occupational safety. Of course, they share commonality. They still try to prevent people from being hurt. But process safety has the peculiar characteristic of being able to kill and hurt a large number of people in one go. And it's something worth bearing in mind. And two particular accidents come to my mind when thinking of the differences between the two. First is the Longford gas plant explosion. This occurred in Victoria and in Australia. And this was a release of flammable hydrocarbon that found a source of ignition and ignited. And there were all sorts of causes for this particular incident, one of which was the lack of engineering support on site, various cost-cutting exercises, and some modifications that had been made to the plant for which there was not a proper fit and appropriate risk assessment to go with it. They had done this before, though. And what had happened was they'd had a release of material, and it was, again, flammable hydrocarbon 2 weeks prior to the accident. And it went down in their incident recording system. But because it didn't catch fire, it was recorded as a slip hazard, an occupational safety hazard, rather than the release of a hydrocarbon that could catch fire. So it wasn't accorded the importance that it should have been. Consequently, they did it again. This time it did find a source of ignition, it exploded, and it killed 2 people as a result. But Longford had a lost time injury rate that was very, very close to 0, and they were very proud of it, oh, rightly so. But as an indicator of whether you're likely to have a process safety incident, it is not a good measure, your measure of occupational safety risk, the LTIs, for example. The same was true at Texas City. So this was the raffinate splitter explosion at Texas City. It is the go-to example for process safety because everything that I'm going to talk about went wrong in that particular instance. But again, they had a very, very low rate of occupational safety incidents right up until they managed to blow the plant up. So that's my point. The point is that we've been doing occupational safety rather well for the last 40 years. We still have accidents, of course, but not as many as we used to have by some considerable margin. And it's it's been the easy hit, if you like. Very often we'll go to sites and we'll see a sign out saying the number of days since the last lost time injury, but never do we see a sign saying the number of days since the last loss of containment or the last time a relief valve opened or something along those lines. So it is important, and both of those particular incidents, both Texas City and Longford, had investigations, and in the case of Texas City, a thorough investigation afterwards. In the case of Texas City, it was the Baker panel that did the investigation, and they came up with these very important observations. So first of all, process safety leadership vital in ensuring that these risks are effectively managed. Texas City, it was not because it wasn't recognized as being a problem up at the top. The number of business unit leaders that site had in the previous 6 years, I think, was 9. And the bonus scheme that they operated meant that the business unit leader was paid a bonus based on production rather than safety, at least process safety. He did receive a bonus for getting the occupational injury rate down. So, of course, if that's where you're paid, that's where you're going to focus your attention. Board level involvement and competence. I did some training for a rather large company, actually, and we had their senior managers in the room, and I asked them who was responsible at board level for process safety. But before they could answer, I asked them to write their answers down, and I collected the piece of paper, and I had 5 different names given to me, 3 of whom were in the room with us. So board level involvement and competence, involvement is one thing, competence is the other. Is that board level involvement able to understand the information that is being presented to them? Because if they don't, they're unlikely to be able to make a correct decision about how best to resource it. And they are the people with the checkbook, so it's worthwhile getting that competence there. And visibility and the promotion of process safety culture as well. Culture is a difficult thing to change. I've got a slide on that coming up shortly. But if you don't see managers walking the walk, as we say, it's less likely that the messages are going to be taken on further down the hierarchy. There is a famous video, and I encourage you to find it. I think it's on the HSE's website, of a spill from a petrol tanker. And there's a huge pool of petrol underneath a filling point, tanker loading station. And nobody panics. I think they've probably done it before. But at the end, when they finally managed to stop the leak, the site manager is seen walking in this pool of petrol. And it does not give the right message to further down the line if the site manager is prepared to do such things. So getting the right competency at the top is important. The same was true for a process safety incident that we had in the UK, and this was Buncefield. After Buncefield, this was a quote from Gordon MacDonald, who was the chairman of the Coma Competent Authority Board. Companies working in highly hazardous industries, strong safety systems in place, underpinned by the right safety culture. This was Britain's most costly industrial disaster, with costs exceeding £1 billion. It was slightly more than that. I was doing some work for one of the companies involved, and I asked them what their potential losses were at that time, and they said about $2 billion that was. And the reason for that was nobody wanted to work with them. It had affected their reputation and their share price so badly, and interrupted their business so badly, that it was those losses that were close to destroying the company, more so than the fines that they had received at the hands of the legal system. So it's worth making that calculation. What is the maximum amount of damage that we could do in our company where we might not have a company to go back to work to afterwards? It's sometimes a lot less than you might think. So process safety management then is, well, we have a blend of engineering and management skills, all of which involve both knowledge and competence as well. But none of this is going to take place unless there is a commitment from leadership to do it, to resource it properly, and to pass that message down throughout the hierarchy. So there is a particular role for leadership to undertake and get right. The roadmap. This is the policy deployment. This has to be a top-down sort of view, a holistic view, if you like. So we're aiming for maximization of value rather than profit maximization. At BP Texas City, it was profit that dictated everything. And of course, the reason is that you will then do things like cut maintenance, you will cut training, and you will cut jobs as a result, because that is the thing that affects the bottom line the most. So leadership have a real opportunity to influence performance. They set the strategic vision, they deploy that policy throughout the organization. And again, I've got some slides coming up on that. Generally, though, it is a higher level, more, what do they call it, a helicopter view, I think, less granular view than management, who are responsible for actually achieving the goals that that policy is in place to try and enact. So leadership has a real opportunity to change the culture of an organization. Culture is a difficult thing to define, so the HSE went ahead and did it. And it's quite a sentence, isn't it? Products of individual and group values, attitudes, competencies, patterns of behaviour that all affect the style and the proficiency of this organisation's health and safety programmes. That's a mouthful, and we came up with a better one, which is how the organisation behaves when no one's watching. If you go in plant at 2 o'clock in the morning on a night shift, is everybody wearing the correct PPE, for example? It's quite a good measure. I always ask companies when doing things like HAZOPs what their safety culture is like, and I have to say it has improved markedly over the last 10-20 years or so. It is a much better position that we're in now than we have been for a while. It is difficult to change culture, though. So we have here 3 boxes, one labeled culture, one labeled attitudes, and one labeled behavior. I can give you 0 actions on how to change the culture, because culture is a product of the attitudes of the individuals in that company. I can give you 0 actions on how to improve attitudes as well. Attitudes are a function of behaviors. And behaviors, well, they are a product of, I don't know if you can see my mouse actually, but I'm wiggling it out. No, yes, you can. You might be able to see the arrow. But these 3 on the left-hand side, systems and processes, coaching and mentoring, targets and objectives, those are the things that can influence behaviors and therefore attitudes and therefore the culture. It's not an overnight thing, though. It has to take time. So targets and objectives, having the correct goals for individuals and departments to meet in order to change their behaviors. Coaching and mentoring, the appropriate training, the appropriate understanding, not so much what we are asking you to do, but why we are asking you to do such things. And the systems and processes that sit underneath that. How easy is it for procedures, etc., to be updated with the full knowledge and input from operators, for example. So all those things combined affect behavior. It is behavior over time that is reflected by attitudes. And once the attitudes are changed, that's when culture actually changes as well. There are very clever people who've written many books on how to change culture. But essentially, they'll all boil down to a diagram that looks like this, and a little bit of patience as well. So for process safety management then, after the Buncefield prosecution, Gordon MacDonald came down the steps and was interviewed by the press, and he gave one of the, what I think is one of the cleverest little sound bites I've heard in a while. It's I think a masterclass. If you ever see it on YouTube, a masterclass in succinct and providing the right message to essentially three groups. One was industry, two was the general public, and three was the legal system. But he did pose three questions that industry should be in a position to answer, and these are clever. Do you understand what can go wrong? What have you got in the business to prevent these things going wrong? And how do you know that those things are working effectively? The reason I say this is clever is because this is a risk assessment. The first thing we do every time we do a risk assessment is to say, well, what are the things that can go wrong? How bad can it be? That's the initiating event and the consequences associated with that. It's only when you understand that you know how good the safeguards need to be to prevent it from happening, or to prevent the harm from being realized. And that comes in three modes of operation, if you like. You can prevent the scenario from happening in the first place. You can control the scenario once you've got a problem going on, by which I mean, for example, if we're talking about an overpressure in a reactor, for example, you fail to prevent it from happening with a control system. Once you've got the overpressure inside, you can control the rate of release via something like a relief valve to a safe location. And that would be an example of a control measure. And then finally, we can mitigate against the harm once it's happened. Things like emergency procedures, evacuation procedures, calling 999 and others. And essentially anything that does one of those three jobs, prevents, controls, or mitigates, is a valid safeguard because it prevents the harm from being realized. And then finally, it's the improvement plan. How do you know that these protective measures are effective? What are the actions you are going to take in order to make sure that they do remain effective throughout their lifetime? And if you've got those prevention, control, and mitigation safeguards in place, they need to be rightly identified as being important and being looked after, tested, maintained, trained on, and all the rest. So this is essentially a risk assessment that needs to be done, and it is what underpins process safety management. The understanding, the engineering bits that go with it, and the learning from experience thereafter. So in order to understand what can go wrong, we do some kind of hazard analysis or some risk assessment, and there are a number of tools and techniques for doing this. If you've been on one of my webinars before, you'll know that I'm a big fan of the hazard identification exercise. It is a very good, robust means of getting out the major accident potential without the extortionate resources that are required for running a HAZOP. LOPA, or layers of protection analysis, is useful for identifying gaps in the protections that you've got. But all of this is dependent on actually having a good understanding of how bad things can be. And that's the second part, the extent and the severity determination, the consequence modelling as well. If you don't have in-house capability of doing that, there are a number of companies, mine included, who will be able to help you to do that. But it's only when you understand what can go wrong that you are in a position to say, okay, if we've got the potential for a fatality here, our safeguards need to be robust against it. If it's a release of flammable material, like in Longford, you need to have better safeguards than if it's a release of lukewarm water, for example. So it needs to be proportions in that sense. And then the second question, third question, what have we got in the business to prevent these things from going wrong? These are the measures we install, and here's this triptych, if you like, this three-pronged approach: prevention, control, and mitigation. Normally we would reduce the likelihood of harmful events, but you can actually reduce the consequences as well. For example, with an environmental release, you might have the release, but if your bunding is effective and correctly sized, then the the consequences reduced. So these management systems are implemented to ensure that those measures have been properly designed, constructed, installed, operated, inspected, maintained, etc. throughout the whole of the plant life cycle. And that goes right from the design right through to decommissioning and demolition at the end as well. Process safety takes you throughout the project life cycle. It is a cradle to grave, as we say. Excuse me 2 seconds, I'll just take a drink. Third question then, how do you know that those protective measures are effective? How does the organisation learn and improve? So you measure. You can measure how often you have losses of containment. You can measure how often you miss inspections. You can measure how often you fail to follow up on references when you're taking new people on, for example. You can learn from investigations about incidents and near misses. But make sure you're investigating and recording the right things. And I take you back to Longford on this one. It was investigated. It wasn't investigated thoroughly enough because of the miscategorization. It was a difficulty with categorization that led to them missing the potential. Audits as well, the effectiveness of the measures and the effectiveness of the management systems as well. And those need to be not only done, but reviewed by management, who, as we said before, need to be knowledgeable and competent to understand what the results of those audits are telling them. Otherwise, remedial action cannot be taken, and any remedial action that is taken might not be resourced correctly. So that management review, 2 words right at the end there, is very important. Policies and procedures. It's the paperwork trail. Relatively straightforward. We should have at the end of it a holistic system that takes us right from the duties of senior managers and senior leaders right down to the implementation of those on in the field on plant, if you like. Policies need to be well understood and implemented well, and they must be workable as well. Most companies have something like a drugs and alcohol policy, and most people working on plant will know that it exists, know what the implications are, and follow it to the best of their ability. This might not be true of process safety. If you do have a process safety policy in place, how many people know about it? How well is it implemented further down the hierarchy? And that is part of policy deployment. And again, we've got some slides coming up about the best way to do policy deployment. Okay, so what are you going to include in your policy? And this is where the framework document comes in. There are a couple that I'm going to mention, but they do virtually the same job. It was what we call a copy and paste effort, I think. There are 2 that we're going to talk about. One is the Centre for Chemical Process Safety, the CCPS, which has 4 what they call pillars, and within those pillars there are 20 elements. And the UK's own Energy Institute guidelines, they have 4 focus areas this time, but only 18 elements, so they've combined a couple there. But you can see the similarity, at least in the contents page. I'm going to tell you mostly about the CCPS because it's the one I'm most familiar with. The first of its pillars, the first of these 4 pillars, is called leadership and culture. Culture, we've seen the slide on how difficult it is to change culture, to manage culture, and that it is a product of other things, the training and the mentoring, the systems and the procedures, etc. Compliance with standards, that is the function that lies up the hierarchy chain. Process safety competence, making sure that they understand what it is that they are being asked to understand. The engagement of the workforce and stakeholder engagement as well. And these are 2 really critical ones. Workforce engagement is the more difficult, I suggest. for the same reason that people were reluctant to hold up their hands and say how joyous they were at the prospect of another safety training course. The engagement is usually there, but it needs to be effective as well. So it is of little use saying to people as part of their appraisal, for example, I would like you to come up with 50 misses, 50 near misses this year. You'll get them, but they might not be very, very useful. It needs to be thought out a little more. The engagement really needs to be effective. So talk to them. Set up things like steering committees for process safety, some focus groups who can champion it whilst on plant as well. And that's going to be one of the things that we talk about at the end when I give you a case study from where we've implemented this previously. The next of the pillars is understanding the hazards and the risk. So this is where the clever people live. This is where the hazard identification and the risk assessment side of things, but also the knowledge management that goes with that. When I'm doing hazard identification and risk assessment exercises, the most important person in the room for me is generally the operator. We'll start off by getting a description of what's going on from a very clever engineer who knows exactly what the drawing says and is jealously guarding his design. And he'll say something along the lines of, yes, we open this valve, start that pump, close this valve, and then we're good to go. And then the operator says, no, we don't. That pump hasn't worked, so we swapped it out for some nitrogen, and then we can't reach that valve, so it's always open, and so on. And all of a sudden you realize that the way the plant operates is not necessarily the way it was intended to operate in the first place. So getting the operators involved as part of this hazard identification and risk assessment is key, but managing the knowledge is even more key, because when that operator leaves or goes on and does something else, that little bit of knowledge goes with him. So it's the proverbial, what happens if this guy gets run over by a bus situation. You need some means of making sure that that knowledge remains and is current within the organization. So my next pillar is the management of that risk. And there are a lot of ways of doing that. And these will provide that prevention, the control, and the mitigation of those major accident hazards. There will be various types as well. Some will be procedural, some will be technical measures, some will be physical items on plants, some will be parts of control systems, and so on. But these are the ones that are sectioned out in the CCPS guidance. The operating procedures themselves must be up to date, relevant, workable, and produced with the operators in mind. The same is true of the safe working practices as well, the general principles of how to work safely on plant. Asset integrity management, this is what I frequently come across as being managed poorly, because we all have plant that is aging, some of it aging by quite some way. The management of contractors on site, this is important because contractors on site give you more people to hurt. They are generally speaking less familiar with your plant than you are. Sometimes they're more familiar with your plant than you are. But in either case, you've still got more people on site, and sometimes you bring on tens of people and they're all thoroughly familiar with your site because they've all done a 20-minute induction video, and that's about the extent of it. Training and performance assurance, management of change. Again, I've got some slides coming up on management of change when we talk about the case study towards the end. Operational readiness, pre-startup safety reviews, things like that, what testing needs to be done. The conduct of operations and the management of emergencies as well. It is getting less and less common for me to see on site a company's own emergency response team. Just the way it is these days. I think that we are more reliant on just shutting things down to a safe state and making sure that people get off site. So the final pillar then is the one labelled learning from experience. How do we do this best? Well, first of all, the components of it: incident and near miss investigations, making sure you're learning from the right things, how you measure your performance and the metrics that go with that, the way to conduct audits, and the management review of that information enables the continuous improvement. In the UK in particular, we are under a continuous improvement regime. It is the legal framework within which we work, simply because in this country we've recognised that there is no such thing as zero risk. We are a small, crowded island, and we do some, well, can do some fairly dangerous stuff. So given that there is no such thing as zero risk, we have to go to, well, what does change over time is technology. What was too expensive to implement before now becomes more, can be implemented for the same cost. So we continuously improve over time. We can continuously improve our working practices as well. But the idea is that we strive to be better next year than we were in previous years, which is a reasonable position to take, I think. So that's my Centre for Chemical Process Safety guidance. The Energy Institute guidelines are very, very similar. Leadership is sectioned out again because it's recognised as being important. The risk assessment side of things, the risk management side, and the review of improvements are very, very similar to what we've seen from the CCPS. So we come back to this idea of what is it that leadership are expected to do. And it is really the policy deployment side of things, the correct resourcing and the understanding that is the function of senior leaders. So for writing policies, we suggest that 5 W's are used: what, where, who, when, and why, all of which are self-explanatory. Policies can do that. Procedures are slightly different because procedures generally are the how of what is required. For example, how to carry out a HAZOP, how to assess confidence, and how to test your vessels and maintain their integrity over their lifespan. So the policy deployment is, it's one of the problems with process safety incidents is that they are, I say it's a problem, it's actually a feature rather than a bug. They are rare. And if they are rare and they happen only once every 20 years or so in a country, the impetus to do something meaningful and rigorous about process safety it can be lost as things fade into memory. The impetus is lost to do things. So it is generally incidents that provoke companies into action. And this was the case with a client of ours a couple of years ago now. They had had a couple of incidents. Resultant out of that was the undertaking of a review stroke audit of the systems that were in place, which enabled the company to identify gaps in the way that process safety was managed. That gap was the subject of a policy and subsequent procedures for filling those gaps. Those procedures were implemented by senior managers and engineers down the hierarchy, and the reporting took place to see if it was doing any good. The policy deployment, it used to be POPMAR, which was plan, organise, then another P, measure, some audit and review, I think, something like that. But it's simpler than that. It's plan, do it, check that it's working, and identify what actions you need to take as a result. And you go around and around that little hamster wheel, planning, doing, checking, and act. It should not take an incident to precipitate that sort of implementation. It should be done simply because we're good employers, and we want to make sure that we learn from experience and that we continually improve over time. So just to wrap up, I shall take you through some recent experience we had with a client and what we did for them for improving their process safety management system. So this particular company, they'd had a series of minor process safety related incidents. So let me just go back a slide. Incidents right at the top. This is what precipitated their review. They'd had a small fire, and a pressure relief system, actually a pressure relief valve had failed to reseat, and there was a continuous release as a result of that. Nobody was hurt during these, but they happened sufficiently close together in the company that they were very happy to take some action against it. So there was an audit that revealed gaps in the hazard identification process that they were operating. They had done a HAZOP, but they hadn't done a recent one, and they'd had different people coming in with slightly different techniques, and to be honest, there were slightly different levels of quality as well with their HAZOPs. There was aging equipment, and they weren't alone in that, and inconsistent training as well. And that was when we did hazard studies for them, that came across during those meetings. We'll point out that they were compliant with the legal minimums, but to quote, the process safety management system was fragmented and reactive. It was not proactive. They hadn't done their due diligence, shall we say. So in 2023, they had a senior management review and decided to up their game. Their aim was to become, or at least to set themselves on the path to become what's known as a high reliability organization. That's more management speak than I wanted to go into in this webinar, but it's essentially transforming of a company, not only from a safety point of view, but also from a business point of view as well. Perhaps I'll do a webinar on that a little later, but the idea was that they would launch a process safety management system improvement program. And ultimately, this was to change the culture within the company as well. It had traditionally been a little laissez-faire. So there were a number of things that we went in and helped them do. And I've split these out into the pillars that we noticed from the CCPS and just pulled out a few of the important ones. So pillar number one, if you remember, was commitment to process safety. So we gave the leadership training sessions. The CCPS has training materials available, but senior leaders within this company were not really understanding previously what information they were being presented with. So it enabled them to correctly resource whatever policy they needed to implement following these audits. They established a vision, and they linked their performance indicators, these key performance indicators as they called them. When talking about process safety, call them that, call them process safety performance indicators. Make them relevant, change them from time to time. If one is running static, go and measure something else that isn't static, and make sure that the frequency with which you're analysing the results is appropriate for the kind of KPI or PSPI that you're looking at. And they got a cross-functional process safety steering committee. So this is something I mentioned previously about workforce engagement. I think they met, it was once a month to begin with, and then those meetings became less and less frequent, but they maintained them, and it never dropped off the radar throughout. So that was commitment one. That was the leadership functions. Under pillar two, the hazards, understanding the hazards and the risks. their drawings were shocking. They updated their P&IDs to an as-built status, which was great to see. And we did a phased run of HAZOP review. It's a good practice to review your HAZOPs once every 5 years, and if there's been any major change, of course. The reason for doing it every 5 years is that you can miss stuff over time, and it's to capture the cumulative effect of many small changes. For example, you might have little changes of, for example, operating conditions, but they can affect long-term health of the plant. Corrosion, for example, can be affected. So it was a good thing to do. They got them in a consistent format with a consistent means of scoring, so that they had a consistent means of comparing relative risk. So they knew that what was going to hurt them fastest and most was going to always come out at the top. So it was a very useful thing to do. Now, where we'd identified particular high risk from those scenarios, they went ahead and did a layers of protection analysis. And this is to compare the safeguarding that they had with the safeguarding that is required in order to be compliant with the law. So this is a gap analysis, if you like. And there are various means of filling that gap. It doesn't have to be a safety instrumented system. It could be for something very, very simple and cheap, like getting the operator out of the area during a particular time, for example. But layers of protection analysis, or LOPA, is traditionally associated with safety instrumented systems. So the next pillar was the managing the risk. And because they had aging plant, it was a mechanical integrity program, which was right at the top of their list. It was a phased program of enhanced inspections, identification of critical equipment, and sequenced planned replacement and updating. After that, they updated the operating procedures, this time with operator involvement. They included things like photographs of particular items of equipment that might be being used, but they also included why we are asking operators to do a certain action and linking it into the potential scenario that could have resulted if they hadn't done it. So there was a clear linkage between what the operator is being asked to do and why he is being asked to do it. This is another reason for bringing operators into things like the HAZOP and the HAZID, because it shows them very, very clearly why it is that we ask them to do things, because the consequences of the accident can be significant. And the third thing they did was to digitize the permit to work system. This was a bit of the paper-based system wasn't too bad, to be honest, but the traceability was so much better with a digitized system. As long as it works, I'm reasonably happy. And then under pillar 4, the learning from experience bit. Root cause analysis training for supervisors. So the reason that relief valve and the reason that they'd had the fire were not terribly well understood. So root cause analysis training for supervisors was a good thing to do. And they decided to develop a lessons learned database for other sites as well. This is very good. This is sharing information. A wise man said that, no, somebody said that a wise man learns from his mistakes, but a wiser man learns from the mistakes of others. So you don't need to learn the lesson yourself. You can learn it from other people. There's a wealth of information out there. Before, I don't know if it's still available, but there was a website run by the European Union on reporting of incidents and so on, and there was a huge database there. Usually it was very good, depending on which country was submitting them, but you could look at these and say, okay, let's have a look at accidents involving chlorine, for example, and somebody had had some corrosion as a result of chlorine, or used the wrong material in a gasket, and you can think, well, actually we use chlorine, we've got gaskets on ours, perhaps it might be worth a look. So this is why I put that little note in at the bottom there. Lessons from across industry are equally important. If you can learn from others, it can save you the pain from having to learn for yourselves. So what did that achieve for them? Now, what was quoted to me was a 60% reduction in process safety incidents. I need to caveat that, really. It depends what they're measuring at the time. I'm not privy to that information at the moment. But if you thought of process safety incidents as things like explosions, and you went down from 0 to 0, that's not a reduction. So they must have been measuring something else, and I suspect it was things like losses of containment, number of times a piece of equipment has failed, number of times an alarm has gone off, or a pressure safety relief valve is lifted, something along those lines. But that's significant. And of course, every time you do reduce one of those process safety incidents, you're essentially uplifting your availability, your plant availability. So it's going to affect your bottom line. It's very rare that I give good news like this. Safety can actually be productive for you as well. They did run process safety audits, and their scores went up 68 to 92%, which was marvelous to see. And they did increase workforce engagement and retention. Again, that's difficult to measure how well somebody is engaged, but if you look at the way that near misses are reported, the willingness of employees to cite examples of where there may have been a failing, for example, and what kind of failing that is, that was the kind of thing that they were looking at, and it paid dividends for them as a result. So it can affect your bottom line in that way as well. All of which brings me to the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, we would be very happy to field them. I shall leave up the contact information there for a while. But otherwise, once again, I do enjoy these. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you all, and I hope you all enjoyed it and got at least a little something out of it. But for now, thanks very much, and have a good evening.